So if people don't, if they're shy, at least we have the agenda up, if anything.
Are you able to see it?
Yes, yes, yes. And I'm pulling up my other documents that I have too. Well, just good morning again, everyone. And happy to call this, I guess, our last official session to order. And as I always do, I'll go through the statement first, the preamble that is important for us to speak through. So the Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in the new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in a proposed new funding formula. So with that, I'd like us to jump right into the last bit of business for us, which is policies. So Dominique, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen on that one. And you all had a chance to look through just the agenda and some of the documents that were shared out. You'll see that there are several policies laid out. We certainly won't have enough time to go through all, not most of them today, but certainly wanted to touch on some of the ones that might be more pressing for us all. And that one, I think, starting with teacher salaries. And so as we think about policies and the policies that we want to be true in order for a new funding formula to move in the way that we would like it to move or be shaped in the way we like it to be shaped, what, if any, requirements should the formula require on investing in new education dollars into existing education salaries moving forward? I think better said, or another way of saying that is, what would we like to think about as it relates to teacher funding? So how do we make sure additional dollars go to teachers? And so that's really open for discussion right now, and we'll take copious notes to make sure that's included in our feedback. So I'll restate it. How do we make sure additional dollars go to teachers as we think about policies?
Okay, I want to jump in on this one. I think we really need to focus funding on bonuses for hard to staff schools, for schools of greater need, and specifically for longevity of those teachers who stay in those positions in schools of greater need. We can't really have equity in our schools until we've got the best teachers in the schools that need them the most. And so I think we really need to focus intentional compensation there on towards, like I said, schools that have, or teachers that have longevity in classroom in schools that are deemed of greater need. And then something else I would like to see is a tiered compensation plan where we have extra compensation for teachers who are mentor teachers.
Sorry, it might be helpful if everybody mutes if you're not talking. Sometimes that helps with the feedback.
Okay, there we go. So extra compensation for mentor teachers, specifically in those schools, or really in any school for this, but mentor teachers who have the longevity, who have the, who are proven, fantastic teachers to stay in their classrooms and always be open and there for other people to come in and learn from them. So mentor teachers in the classroom, not just mentor teachers who are there and wandering through the school and helping teachers. So I think we need a tiered compensation plan that focuses on keeping the best teachers in the classroom.
I really like that. And just to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds a little bit like you're speaking to retention. I don't want to simplify what you're saying, but What are your thoughts around how retention plays into that?
Retention certainly, but retaining those teachers in their specific schools where there's the greatest need.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for that clarification. What are some other thoughts around teacher salaries and policies? And if anybody wants to build off of Christy's thought as well, that's welcome.
I was going to say, I don't have any new thoughts. I like every one of Christie's. Those were, yeah, well said.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I like what Christy has said as well. I do want to add on top of that, some of our teachers are some of the most highly educated in tiers for education, and some consideration around as they continue to get advanced degrees, increasing salaries along that realm as well.
I appreciate you sharing that. That also, I think there are a lot of education, professional development programs, certification programs. I would love to get your thoughts on how those might play into what you've just described, if there's a direct relationship with those programs, or if there's something else in addition to those programs. Sorry, Dr. McKinney, that was for you. Just given your.
Oh, so sorry.
I'll restate it. So I know there are a lot of professional development programs out there, certification programs out there for new and existing teachers. I'm just curious from a policy standpoint, how you might see those playing into what you've just described.
Sure. So I know the state has provided some grants and some funding for teachers to get ELL endorsements and special ed endorsements, and those endorsements in critical areas, and they have paid for that to happen. Kind of looking at it from a sustainability model, how can we continue to support teachers who are getting endorsements in those critical areas that we're needing? On top of the fact, some teachers are also going back to get master's degrees and in many cases doctoral programs to advance their understanding and their input in education. How are we supporting those teachers who are getting advanced degrees in those areas as well? So kind of looking at it in a multifaceted way on how we support educators as a whole who are continuing to advance and advance their learning and continuous improvement in professional development.
Thank you for that.
There's also, I think, national certification programs as well that there are some incentives for, but just kind of looking at all of those different areas to continue to support teachers as they're continuing to advance for the benefit of our students.
Some additional thoughts on those. And then also, again, from the vantage point of parents, whether we are parents, educators, or we work on behalf of parents, thinking about the parental voice here, not that has already been exhibited, but as we think about responding to these policies from a parent voice, what are some other thoughts?
I don't want to monopolize this conversation, but this is kind of a big deal for me. This is a lot of my world that I've been looking at right now and dealing with and living in. But one of the things I would love to see as a policy is, and I don't know that this could be put into the plan, it may be something we have to talk about, But if districts offer, and I'm not trying to say we need to make a decision for districts on what they offer in this with their flexibility, but if districts offer after-school incentive bonuses for teachers, then they need to consider athletics should be as a policy on, and art should be equalized with the policy. So in other words, I have a teacher who is a football coach and he gets a certain level of bonus, and I have a teacher who is works with an after-school arts program or puts on an after-school play, that bonus level, that incentive level should be considered equally as a policy, right? So that it incentivizes teachers to do the same things across the board and our children have access to more things. A lot of teachers don't do after-school activities that are arts related necessarily because they feel less valued than athletics. So I think saying as a policy, if your district offers these incentive levels for after-school activities, athletics or arts need to be at the same incentive levels. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think starting with policy, because I think what that looks like in practice is complicated at best. However, I think it starts with thinking about policy, and once that's something that we put out there from a policy perspective, then we could start to think about how we address it from a tactical standpoint. So I really appreciate you naming that. And for I guess all of us, keep that in mind. It's not that the policy itself is something that we would take that and implement it in the moment. It's just something that we should be considering as we think about this new BP, this new funding formula, and what it might mean to reshape and rethink some of the policies that currently exist and come up with some new ones as well.
I think to add on to this conversation around teachers as well is the disparity in representation of educators of color. I know there's some initiatives across our state to increase the number of highly qualified educators of color in our school systems across the state. So it would behoove me not to bring that up, that we need to look at that from a policy perspective and sustainability perspective as well.
Now, I don't want to shift into a different topic just yet, but that just naming that around diversity speaks to some of the other areas around policy, around policies that might come to mind. So I'm just naming that as we speak even to this policy or others, if others come to mind, I think we can jump back and forth, but certainly want to make sure we get through at least 2 or 3 policies that we could respond to. All right, well, if there's nothing else in the teacher salaries piece, maybe we can scroll down a little to outcomes. And you'll see that there's one related to middle and elementary. That doesn't mean we can't touch on high as well, but if we just start with the first one, the middle school outcomes, the steering committee would like to see options for middle school and what outcomes might we recommend as it relates to policies. And if we recall from, I think it was our last session, if not the one before, or the 2 before that, is we think about some of the recommendations either lean elementary heavy or middle school heavy, some are high school heavy. And so there seems to be a disparity around addressing all of them equally, if you will. And I believe, I'm not sure if it was you, Christy, or another parent who spoke to the idea that, or the reality that you have kids in those different respective areas, you're seeing different, you're seeing a different emphasis placed as it relates to where they are, and there's some discrepancies there. And so I think this is an area where we can definitely address as it relates to outcomes for middle, elementary, and even high.
I do have to ask a question. Before, when we talked about outcomes, we discussed the possibility of the punitive nature that we're looking at related to outcomes. Has there been more discussion about that, where we're tying funding to these outcomes, and it could potentially put us in a place where we are continuing to support more affluent districts and punish lower economic districts?
We haven't talked about it more, but this is certainly, this isn't off the table, particularly for even a policy like this, right? We could name something like that in a policy that, as it relates to outcomes, they aren't punitive in nature, or they aren't tied to funding per se. And so we could certainly shape that even in this discussion as a recommendation. So if that's what I'm hearing you say, we can make note of that, and we can build on that, or even go in another direction, but at least have that as something that we want to talk about or want to bring to the steering committee.
I just wanted to say, well, as a proponent, outcomes kind of make me a little uncomfortable, tying funding, as we've all talked about, because of equity, because of all these other things. They do make me uncomfortable. But if we are going to go that route, thinking about, well, across all grades, but especially elementary school, I think if I saw some kind of funding tied to outcomes, I think I would like to see something tied to schools focusing, or teachers focusing on the foundation in elementary school, which I think is approaches to learning and social and emotional development, getting children ready to learn. So some kind of, and I don't know what that would look like. I don't know what the assessment or screener, or how we would look at that. There's a lot of different options there, but I would like to see something along those lines in elementary school. I mean, of course, literacy is important. Of course, math is important, but I think we also have to put our money, what we value. If we're valuing children being ready to learn, if that's what we're saying that we value, then that's where we need to put the money. And so for schools that are focusing on those things, focusing on getting children to the point that they are ready to learn math and literacy and all the other important academics, then I think that that's somewhere that we could start in elementary school. I mean, I love it for all ages, but especially elementary school, focusing on those areas.
Well, this is Sherry, and I'll just kind of piggyback with that. In Indiana, one of the outcomes that they used was if a school offered certain courses, they considered that an outcome, and it was a weighted bump for that area. So I think, just piggybacking off of what you just said, if we think about the schools offering those courses, you might only have a few students as you begin to build that program, but that takes away the punitive piece and really gives you money to build your program if you're focusing on the outcome of what you're offering.
I like that. And I like, yeah, it does. And I like how you said that it helps you start to build, if we're, because by the time children get in high school, they might not be at a point where they can pass an AP exam, or they might not, so if we're starting early and starting to build that up, and then also, yeah, I love that idea.
Right. Because one of the things they did there is recognize that all students weren't ready to take algebra. But what they did was, if you're offering those courses to build into algebra in elementary and middle school, then you received that weighted funding. So you were building that up.
I love that. And that's what my thing was, my thought was as well, that we need to shift from it, the focus of this being from, how many kids are passing this to how many kids are taking this, how many kids have the opportunities, because then it's no longer punitive, but we're expanding the opportunities for all kids. And I think that's what the outcome should be focused on, the number of opportunities they have to be,
Right.
Post-secondary ready versus you know, are you passing or are you not passing, but do you have that opportunity to move forward? And I think we need to talk about that as a policy coming from us, that we want to shift that.
Well, I think we shift the definition of what we believe the outcome is, right? So if we clearly articulate that we believe the outcome has to be the opportunity that builds up, then that's clearly in the definition.
I love that.
It seems like we're differentiating between output and outcome, and really digging into what outcomes really mean, and ensuring that it's not punitive in nature, but more around effort and intent.
But I think we're trying to help people get to a point where they're offering it to be able to build it so that the outcome will come for those students as they progress, right?
I think that's right. And then how do we do it in a way that we don't ding them in the end if they ultimately offer it, but then don't show the quote unquote outcomes by a certain period of time, right? Because then what that means is they're less likely to offer it if they think that they're going to be penalized for it if they don't achieve the quote unquote outcomes, even though the effort is there, the intent is there, the good intentions are there.
And I think tying specifically back to the middle school element of this, middle schools, we really are kind of the redheaded stepchild of the education world sometimes, you know, and because we focus on littles, we focus on bigs. I think if we're refocusing outcomes to, you know, if we're redefining in this process, then we can include middle schools in that and say, are they including opportunities for tie-ins that prepare them for high school? Are they offering foreign language classes that can be used for high school credit? Are they offering algebra or advanced math options that then can allow a child to do more in high school? So it would be offering more options in the middle school setting that would then tie into what a student is going on. So it comes right back to what we've just said in offering the opportunities, but tying it in a little bit earlier, and it's that buildable piece as well.
Yeah, and also, you know, think about it this way: if you're focused on the offering, your second level can even be that ultimate outcome. So you're weighting your funding and you're building your policy around the offering, and then you're giving the double bump when they get to the accountability piece. Then you're really able to take that funding and build out your program. Does that make sense?
It does. Sorry, my microphone was muted, but yes, it does. And I see some other head nods as well. So I don't want to take us off track here. However, since accountability was mentioned, and I know outcomes is a hot button based on our last call, I would imagine accountability is one too. So what are our thoughts around that as it relates to policy and even what we're talking about as it relates to outcomes? I guess what I'm saying is I don't want to assume that we feel the same way about accountability as we do about outcomes. If we do, great. If we don't, then what's the difference here?
Okay, Darren, just tell me to stop if you want me to stop. I'm giving time for everybody else, but if nobody jumps in, I think we have to refocus our accountability as well. I think this is, again, when it comes back to teaching, when it comes back to how we're looking at schools, this is one area that if we're creating from the ground up, we have to really rethink about. And I think we have to come at it with a growth mindset. I think it's imperative that we refocus our accountability on growth within our schools versus, you know, standardized measurement as we have been. And are we and that's really what it comes down to for me. I mean, how are we looking at our schools right now? There's so much that's not accounted for within our school makeup with our student body and what teachers are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, what kids are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So we have to refocus, and I think we do feel the same way from an accountability standpoint as we do an outcome standpoint, that we've got to stop penalizing schools for things that they shouldn't be held accountable for.
I just want to piggyback onto that and say that I think we need to be careful with accountability. I think Bob, I watched the recording from last time, I wasn't able to attend, but I think he touched on it last time about that we want to be careful that that we are not using standardized testing, assessments, screeners in accountability ways, in ways that those tests and assessments were not designed to be used. So that is something that I think we need to be very careful about as well.
I have, I guess, a clarifying question. So, in the framework that the state put out, where it says high school outcomes scoring a 21 on the ACT, right? Is the funding going like the more students you have doing that, the more funding you get? Or is it a matter of programs that will, like funding programs that will lead to that outcome? Like, what is the focus on the dollars for those outcomes?
Dominique, correct me if I'm wrong. Even right now, everything is still very much in draft mode. I don't think we've reached a level of specificity to say which one it is or isn't. But I think that's why it's important for us to have these conversations around policy, right? Because that will help us. I mean, even what we're saying around how accountability should be used, how we should use tests. Maybe we are wanting to shape a policy that says that it's not about ACT scores or how many students score blank on whatever exam, but more around just what are we doing to get to the positive outcomes. And as long as schools are doing that, then there'll be, because even as I think about the word reward, like I don't think we want to move to a place where our funding is rewarding schools. Rather, we want to set a baseline so that all schools are getting an opportunity to serve all kids. And then our hope then is from an accountability standpoint, from an outcome standpoint, that then those things will go up and up and up. But we want to make sure that even if they aren't, that they're getting the tools that they need to self-correct, if anything.
If you don't mind, I'm going to go back and pull up that part of the draft formula just so we can lay our eyes on it, or the draft framework. And then we'll go back to our document. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And I will clarify here, and just like Derwin said, this is still not something that is in stone. This is a draft, and all of the feedback pieces will be taken around this. But where this ACT of a 21 or higher is referenced, it's not a standalone. It's a part of the Ready Grad indicators. So there are multiple pathways for a student to be Ready Grad. And I think, part of the intent here would be to have districts offering more of these pathways. And ACT of a 21 or higher is one of the ways that somebody can be a Ready Grad. If you look at the footnote at the bottom, it talks about the other ways. So that ACT, as it's put here, is not meant to be a standalone piece. ASVAB is one of the pieces. A student can complete 2 early post-secondary opportunities plus an industry certification. So I think offering these would also be a part of the intent behind, getting districts to increase their offerings. You can just let me know when you're ready for me to go back to the document.
I think this is helpful to have up. I think while we stay on this topic of accountability and outcomes, maybe we can leave this document up. I'm sorry, maybe we can leave it up, and then as we shift into another, other policies that might move away from this, because I think having this up helps to sort of spark additional, at least for me at least, correct me if I'm wrong, others, but additional thoughts around what we're sharing. And one thing in particular is around how much we focus on high school outcomes. So if we look at this from a district perspective, how much we focus on high school outcomes, that somehow then those dollars don't get to the elementary school or to the middle school, that ultimately need to inform what happens at the high school level. I think that's something that is sorely missing, and that we need to spend more time on: the early childhood education, elementary school, middle school funding that ensures that we could get to these places in high school in the first place.
Agree. This is Blair. Sorry I was late to the meeting today. Had an unavoidable conflict.
Well, thanks for being here, and conflicts are unavoidable at times, so totally get it. Blair, I'm not sure what point you came in, but just to catch you up, we jumped right into policies. We talked a little bit about teacher salaries, and we're spending some time on outcomes as it relates to elementary and middle. Outcomes and accountability, and what does that mean? Not saying that we need to have a policy that says accountability needs to be tied to funding. We could even be talking about a policy that ensures that funding and accountability aren't tied together so directly, but might inform one another or might just be different altogether. So not saying that we should be doing one or the other, but really speaking to a policy that addresses our concerns around accountability and outcomes and what that means for funding. And speaking a little bit about what we talked through at our last call around this, which I know you were on.
Thanks for that. I'd love since Bob just popped on, he made some comments that I thought were very helpful last time on this topic, where he spoke to the matter of outcomes based sort of funding. We would need to be mindful of not sort of working across purposes with our current accountability system and avoid anything that might sort of conflict and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, or maybe just a revisit.
Hi everyone. I sincerely apologize for being late today. I value the time with you all, and just something came up I had to deal with. Again, I just want to stress, philosophically, I'm very sympathetic to the idea. I just think people really have to understand how many conflicting incentives and priorities that schools are currently juggling, and the implicit, they would just really have to be clear on both how, what is the goal that the incentive would be based on, and how well does it align with the other ways we are already held accountable. Because if there's any remote conflict between what you would optimize to get the financial bonus versus what you're supposed to optimize to reach the goals the state has already set for you, right? That can set up real cognitive dissonance and conflict among folks. And then last but not least, depending on what measure they were using, it could just create more problematic incentives around ethical administration of assessment. I'm not giving accusations on anyone. I'm just saying, look around. If you read in the paper, as high stakes accountability has increased around the country, there's been seemingly increased instances of abusive of test practices and unethical test administration for purposes of influencing the outcome. And I just think this is a potentially extremely consequential thing, whether it's people actually cheating on tests and giving kids answers, or whether it's selective attendance practices with respect to who's in school the day it's tested, right, to affect the numerator of the score. And so I'm just trying to be extremely realistic about how this works in practice. So it's nothing against the concept of let's sort of reward good performance. it's how how that can problematically work out. And really more than anything, I think the conflicting goals thing is probably a bigger issue than the ethical piece. So those are just my concerns about that concept. I don't know if that was helpful, but there you go.
Was to me. Thank you. It certainly seems well put to me.
So I'm trying to work on this recommendations document, and I'm just, if you can help me have a clear recommendation that you all would want to put in regards to that.
Well, I would just maybe add a sentence or two without wanting to speak to for anyone else. If people were uncomfortable sort of saying the group discourages this concept, I might sort of say, you know, the alignment between the measure for the incentive would have to be very, very clearly defined in relation to the existing accountability system to ensure that there were no conflicting priorities. I mean, I think that at the absolute minimum, that's what I would stress. I mean, just to give you an example, the universal screener that we do as an elementary school, right, for reading, for early childhood development, has certain aspects of, say, phonetic development, phonetic blending and segmenting, et cetera, that it emphasizes. It is not precisely the same set of skills in the same order that are tested for on 10 Ready. So is it a good idea to have a universal screener and to be monitoring phonics at a, yeah, absolutely. But then the problem is if that test incents you to teach these skills in this order, but then a different test you take assumes a different sequence of skills learned, what are you to do as a teacher? Which skill do I teach in which order? Because I'm taking two different tests that want me to prioritize different skills at the same time. I hope that makes sense to people, and I imagine that that plays out at other academic levels. And so what I'm saying is the alignment would need to be very, very tight, so you're not saying on the accountability model, you'll get an A if you do this, but on the bonus model, you'll get $500 if you do that. And then we're introducing a conflict between what we're asking people to do. So that would be the kind of alignment at minimum that they would need to establish before implementing something like this.
And so, Bob, I hear that, and I think when I'm thinking about the collective, that alignment, and I would imagine even for you, becomes difficult to achieve when that if it really is narrow. How do you do that for, let's say, a Montessori school, and at the same time do that for a more traditional curriculum? And how do you do that for, let's say, an international baccalaureate curriculum? And so the narrowing in, I think those are some of the concerns that, at least I'm assuming those are some of the concerns that are bubbling up on this call. And so then how might we create a policy or speak to a policy that says, hey, it's about addressing the vehicle, or making sure that those vehicles are in place to get to an outcome, but not necessarily funding us based on the outcome.
Yeah, I think that point, what you just said, hits home for me, especially thinking around like in Memphis. I mean, outcomes are just so vastly different right now. So if we're putting this in place, I think it's going to create a layer of inequity in funding where schools who have already had the opportunities to reach this level of success are going to get this additional funds, where schools who have not had the opportunities to reach this level of success are not going to get these funds. So I think it's important that we're able to provide the programs necessary to help those students who have not had these outcomes before reach these outcomes, before we can start measuring them all in this way.
I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, I worry about, especially as we want to honor different programs. We know we have students who are different all over. schools, districts, they all look so different. I do wonder about how narrow we get when it comes to this idea of outcomes and accountability from a funding perspective. I think there are certain areas where there are baseline levels that we can hold up as these are the outcomes we would like to see no matter what. But then tying, I think the question that we all have and that Bob raised, not only Bob, but including Bob raised in the last call, was around what it means to actually tie funding to outcomes and how problematic that might be.
I really don't want to belabor the point because I'm sure there's more to talk about. But the only other thing I didn't sort of say that I would just reiterate from last time is I think there's maybe I don't know if the premise behind this is like, well, people just need to be more motivated to work towards the goal. I think that that's the wrong premise. I think that in the last 8 to 10 years, we have had a extraordinary, and in my view, very positive set of reforms in Tennessee around standards, curriculum, assessment, accountability, teacher preparation, et cetera. And we've made, it's like been an earthquake of reform. And then we've had sort of all the pandemic and everything happening in the last 2 years. And we're obviously not near where we want to be yet, but I think there's this assumption that we're just not motivated. And so we need maybe a financial incentive to encourage people on more. I really don't think that's the case. I think even for an exceptionally well-organized and strategically focused and disciplined school, our context is unbelievably chaotic right now. And we are trying to see through a lot of initiatives. And so I think that the idea that let's add like yet another layer of something to keep track on is I think people just underestimate churn and how much constant change in education makes it difficult to see any initiative through. I think we're better off addressing the fundamental equity issue we have through the base model and then revisiting an incentive after a time once this piece has settled. I don't think the problem right now is that my reading teachers aren't getting higher scores because they want a $500 bonus. Like, that's not the problem. We're implementing all of these other pieces and need to sort of see that through, and then we can sort of add that on at that point. But there's nothing scientific about changing 20 independent variables at once, right? You've got to sort of see through the things you've tried before you add more changes, because otherwise you can't isolate the effects. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. What are some thoughts and reactions to that? I see some head nods, some aren't on camera, so I'm not sure if there's any disagreement, but we'd love to get other thoughts.
Yeah, I think Bob makes a lot of sense. But there's nothing that he said that I disagree with. And I feel similarly, I'm very inclined towards outcomes. I like that notion of an outcomes focused approach, but I think I have some of the same concerns that he has expressed. I wonder as I try to think out of the box a little bit here about outcomes, and I think one of the things, and I'm really thinking out loud here, so I'm not sure about this, but one of the things that we want to give incentive to, I think, is innovation. And we want to be encouraging schools to do that. And sometimes that can be scary and that can be hard and it can be risk-taking and it can take time and energy away from other things to try new ways and innovate. And I wonder if outcomes funding might be well suited to be connected to innovations tried that had successes. And that's about as far as I'm going to go with that. I haven't thought that through very clearly.
But I appreciate that, and the good part is none of these thoughts have to be fully half or even a quarter baked for us to be able to build on and to be able to grapple with. I wonder about what you just shared, and even then leaning into what Bob shared and what Christy and Melanie have shared and what others have shared, what does that mean then from when do we get to the point where that innovation or that thing that is tried, we know works and works across all schools so that we can hold that as an accountability measure? Like when is, and maybe speaking to a policy around this, maybe having a moratorium on updating or adding more levels of accountability before other levels have been truly assessed over a given time. And that's not to say schools or districts can't innovate from within, but in terms of to what they will be held accountable, capping that at a certain level so that they can continue to innovate without feeling like it's punitive if it doesn't work out. If there's nothing else on outcomes, if there is, feel free to jump in. If not, from a policy perspective, we only have about 12 minutes left. I can't help but to potentially open up a can of worms with this, but curious to get everyone's thoughts on the funding year policy. I think there could be assumptions around how we all stand as it relates to this, and I don't want to make that assumption. And so the question that the subcommittee or the steering committee has is, should funding reflect the current year or the prior year? And for fast-growing districts, it may be beneficial. I'm just reading this verbatim. For fast-growing districts, it may be beneficial to receive the funds in real time to meet the cost of that year. And for declining enrollment districts, it may be harder to adjust budgets in real time. Given that challenge, are there mitigation ideas? Big question, should the funding reflect the current year or the prior year, which it does now?
Hey, Derwin, this is Maya. I'll just jump in really quickly. Just speaking from the context of some of the public charter schools, and I assume it may also be relevant to traditional schools that experience growth. We have had anecdotally several charter schools where they are in a position that they're serving a dozen, 2 dozen, 50, 100 more kids than they had the previous year, but they're not getting the dollars for them because of that model. And so it is quite a tension for some of the schools who are experiencing growth, schools and districts. And so I would lean more towards the current year, but I'd love to hear from some school leaders and some superintendents on the call, perhaps.
I just wanted to jump in. I worked in an aviation industry previously, and I think of this as needing to fund in real time, as when we would buy fuel for aircraft, whatever we had in the tank, we might have 2,000 gallons at worth $10,000. But for us to be able to buy the next bit of gas, we got to flow our prices in real time. And I worry, as the previous individual stated, that if you have an influx of students this year, you're not going to be able to cover it with last year's dollars.
That was fascinating. I'd never thought about it from that perspective. Thank you for sharing it. I would just say, Derwin, on this point, in having the unique perspective of work both as a charter school administrator and at the district level in a district with significant annual fluctuations in enrollment, I think that it is the fiduciary responsibility of districts to prepare for their rainy days and to sort of to hold back schools or districts that are dynamically growing, and particularly when they're serving significant special need student populations. Of a delay, the lag year has a very problematic implication. I would be strongly in favor of real-time true-ups, and then it's the responsibility of districts to have their rainy day funds to hand and reserves to handle fluctuations. I think if we're ultimately optimizing for students, then to make students wait so that a district can have a reserve, I think that's a district responsibility and shouldn't be put on the students.
Yeah, I lean towards the real-time funding. I lean strongly toward the real-time funding and for a true up. And I'm thinking as the perspective of a parent, I don't want to hear that my child isn't getting what she needs because the school only has funding based on last year that doesn't consider my child who's going to the school this year. That doesn't sit well with me. I want to know that my child is getting the dollars that that proportionally belong to her because she goes to that school currently, not because this school looked different the year before. And I think it then is also the responsibility, not just of the district, but for the schools that might be declining in enrollment to be honest about that when it comes to the true up and hand the dollars back if they receive more dollars than they had kids.
I agree with that. This is Sherry. And the other thing to think about is, especially if we're moving to a funding model where our SPED students or our EL students are receiving more funding, if you pick up those students who are SPED, EL, economically disadvantaged, however that ends up coming out, and you're serving those kids now, you have to be able to serve those kids now and have those dollars.
Totally agree. What are some other thoughts? I thought this would be more controversial than apparently it is. It seems like we're all in agreement around this, and it's okay if we're not. We'd love to get some opposing views or different views from what we've shared so far, if there are. Okay, going once, going twice. With that, I'm looking at the time here. We have just about 5 minutes left. Are there any policies that we haven't addressed that we feel strongly we need to at least bring to the table?
I would like to, if we have time, just talk about professional development. And we did talk about that a little bit earlier in the call when we were talking about teacher salary, but I think that it's someone had mentioned earlier about postgraduate work and certifications and those things are wonderful and fabulous, but thinking about professional development for everyone, I would love to see professional development for all staff on supporting students and families who are English learners. I would also love to see professional development. This is kind of my soapbox, but building students' capacity to learn through social and emotional development. I think that there is a knowledge gap with some teaching staff on how that builds a foundation for children to be ready to learn. So I would love to see more professional development for all staff on that as well.
Thanks, Melanie. Glad you brought that up. Didn't want to leave anything out there. Anybody have any thoughts around that, around professional development and training policies?
Agree with what Melody said.
Derwin, my only response, I don't want to be a broken record on this, but just going back to the first meetings, from a practical standpoint, I couldn't agree more strongly. Probably the single biggest thing that we do at our school that makes a difference, I think, in our impact for our kids is the unique approach we take to ongoing teacher professional development. So practically, I couldn't agree more strongly. And we have an extremely unique curriculum, which is part of why we have to do it. But the flip side is I continue to want to understand from a funding model standpoint, what's the difference between us saying, here are the creative ways we want to use funds versus how should they determine and assign funds? It's like with the whole technology debate we had a meeting or two ago. I just don't want to be in a situation where there's a lot of the funding is tied into narrowly prescribed programs where they're saying, well, you've got to spend it this way on PD or this way on technology. I'm more than happy to hear about all the other schools doing brilliant things with technology. Bravo. My opinion about all the dusty smart boards around the state does not apply to them. What I just want to make sure is that we don't see a lot of the money tied up in programmatic streams there, as opposed to sort of saying, sure, these are general needs. It'll factor into how we estimate the needs for a school in general, but not determine how it's spent. So that's, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Rob. Any other thoughts in the last couple of minutes? Or any other policies that we want to bring to the table? Just keep in mind, if there is something, we want to make note of that, and that way we can share that with the steering committee. So want to make sure
that I'm,
voices
but did we cover the K2 weight?
We did not. So
Okay.
if there are any thoughts you want to share on that?
That's interesting. That's back to the conversation we had last week about that pre-K to third grade age band and moving that sort of up more prominently, that the emphasis and investment in that age band more prominently up. I think Bob made some comments around that. I think, you know, the weighting, you know, there are each different age band has special initiatives and programs and that could be beneficial and that some might consider important. And I'm not sure if using a weight to address that is the best way to do it. But I just, generally speaking, certainly believe that we ought to be weighting our investments much more heavily in the early years and laying the foundation and recognizing the importance of doing that, and that the return on investment of that is, to the extent we do it right and well, is very significant. So I would, you know, in concept, amen that. Obviously, as with all of this, the devil's in the details. And they're asking how much you might consider a K2 weight or additional investment, and I'm not sure the answer to that.
I thought about this a little bit since last meeting, Blair, and I know we're almost out of time, but just to briefly add one thing. I mean, my point was, I mean, I also am in favor of a bigger weight for early learning. What I was trying to say last time is the problem is the tail often wags the dog. It's like, well, if we have a different weight for a different level, then they're able to do more, and then we say we need more. And when I was looking at the Ed Build data, a lot of states do it differently. Here's the simplest argument on this. In our state policies, the legally a permissible class size for K2 is smaller than it is for older grades. If we're going to say your class sizes have to be smaller, then we have to proportionally weight your funding higher, because then we're saying the amount of funding available per classroom is less than it is in older kids with a bigger economy of scale. If older children are able to access curriculum more independently, and then we've said, therefore, they can have larger class sizes, then we have to sort of say, if we're only allowing you to put this many kids in this class, then your funding has to be weighted higher. I mean, I think that's the simplest argument.
That's a great way to look at it. That's a great way to look at it. Very helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and want to be sensitive. I know we're about a minute over, sensitive everyone's time. I think the one thing I'm hearing around that too, or at least one thing I'm taking from this, is that I think we've spent so much time, or we spent so much funding the higher grades, that we're really speaking about equity now. It's not even that the lower grades need more funding than the higher grades. They just need more funding in general because they haven't been funded to the same degree in terms of when you talk about the emphasis on the curriculum and your class sizes and what have you. So definitely points are well taken. Notes, we've taken all those notes, and we'll make sure to get that out to everyone and send that to the steering committee. So with that, again, sorry that we went a little over. This is our last official meeting, so just want to, just from the bottom of my heart, thank everyone for their time and commitment to this. This is really important work, and we've all just shown that we're committed to this, and I'm very, very much appreciative for all of your voices. And also want to encourage you all to stay engaged even after this. There are ways to just stay in the know and to still have your voices being heard. I know, Dominique, really quickly, I know you wanted to find out if anyone was interested in going to the State of the State. So I want to.
Yes, and we skipped attendance at the beginning, so I want to make sure that I captured everybody correctly, if that's okay.
Sure, please.
So I have, and I know a couple of people have left the call, but I think I've captured the ones. So I've got Wendy, Trey, Darnell, Tom, Senator Potty, Ashlyn Sparks, Sherry Hage, Jennings, Wilson, Christy, Highfield, Dr. Naba McKinney, Melanie Allen, Blair Taylor, Bob Nardo, Maya Bug. Derwin, I have you down too as well. I skipped your name. Did I miss anyone? Okay. So yes, thank you all so much for allowing me to support you through this process. Derwin, thanks for leading this group through this process. The State of the State is at 6 o'clock in Nashville Monday on the 31st. So I will be in attendance there, and it is open, first come, first serve. But if anybody is interested in planning to come, if you'll let me know, we'll try to, if we can, save some spots. But I've thoroughly enjoyed working with each of you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And if you all can attend, please let Dominique know. And Dominique, thank you for just keeping us in line and keeping us in order and in shape, and very much appreciate it. And you all enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Darwin.